You guys, today we're talking about the Sumerian King's List, which is a highly controversial document. That contradicts the mainstream narrative of a lot of things. It consists of the lineage of the Sumerian kings and the lifespans of these kings, and it's super controversial also because it's highly contradicting to mainstream science itself. So let's just get into the controversy of the Sumerian King's List and what it is, and let's do this.
In 1922, an expedition led by British archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell was sifting through the dust of Larsa, an ancient city-state in southern Iraq. Beneath layers of sun-baked silt, they hit something solid, a four-sided prism of baked clay that, at first glance, looked like a modest office paperweight. It stood only 8 inches tall, yet every inch of its surface was covered in a dense, rhythmic pattern of cuneiform script. While its physical size was small, the timeline it carries was so expansive, it challenged our entire understanding of human history. This is the Weld-Blundell Prism, the most complete version of the Sumerian King List. It's essentially an official index of every city and every ruler that ever held power in Mesopotamia, but it doesn't read like a standard government record. It begins with a line that feels more like the start of a high fantasy novel than a dry historical document. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Now, mainstream archaeology tells us that
Kingship descended from heaven. Come on, bro. That 100% contradicts whatever is mainstream historical narrative.
Eridu was one of the world's first cities, established around 5400 BC. But if we actually look at what the Sumerians wrote on this prism, the math simply doesn't add up. It does not make any sense whatsoever if you try to fit it into our modern timeline. The list claims the first king, Alulim,
Because the modern timeline itself is fake.
ruled for 28,800 years. His successor? Another 36,000 years. In just the first 5 cities mentioned, the list insists that 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Think about that for a second. That is 250,000 years covered by just 8 guys. To put that in perspective, 240,000 years ago, modern humans were barely even a thing, according to the standard evolutionary model.
Yeah, whatever this document is, 100% contradicts, the modern timeline. Modern timeline contradicts everything in history. That's also crazy.
We were supposed to be sharpening sticks in caves, not maintaining complex bureaucratic king lists in stone-walled cities. Usually, when academics see numbers like this, they roll their
I never believed in the sticks, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the sticks and fire narrative. That's narrative's always been even if that's because narratives are taught in school, those ideas seem kind of dubious. Always seems kind of dubious. Even I've heard it for the first time, like the Stone Age. Now they know how to use iron. So started the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. All these narratives, these are presupposed historical narratives, and there's no iota of proof on regard any of this specific period, or such as periods such as Ice Age and Paleolithic Age. All these ages, there is no a greater amount of evidence to show these ages what they actually say they are and happen with things that happen actually in these ages.
eyes and call it poetic exaggeration or mythological padding. And sure, I'm no Assyriologist, but if I tell you I caught a fish this big and then provide a detailed, verified GPS log of every fishing spot I visited for the rest of the week, would you assume I lied about the first part just because the fish sounded too large? Here's the problem. As the list moves forward, these astronomical lifespans start to drop. They go from 30,000 years to 1,200 years, then eventually to reigns of 30 or 40 years, lifespans we recognize today. The terrifying part is that the same document listing these impossible early kings eventually lists rulers we know for a fact were real. We found their palaces, their inscriptions, and their tombs. So, where exactly does the myth end and the history begin? Did the Sumerians just decide to start telling the truth halfway through the prism? Or are we missing something fundamental about the era they call the Antediluvian?
So halfway the list becomes true. Why would it fake the halfway? Is it to embellish it about their origin? Maybe that could also be the case.
Age. And if these 8 kings weren't just legends, then who or what were they really? To understand why the Sumerians recorded such staggering numbers, we have to look at the 8 figures who defined the antediluvian or pre-flood era. These weren't just names on a page, they were the foundation of a civilization. The list begins in the city of Eridu with Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years. He was followed by Alalngar, who sat on the throne for 36,000 years. When the kingship moved to the city of Bad Tibira, the reigns continued to defy modern biology. Enmen-Lu'ana ruled for 43,200 years.
First of all, how are you gonna brush past that this dude ascended from heaven and started the kingship?
Enmen-Gal-Ana,
Almost like the biblical narrative of fallen angels. You know, came down from the heavens, and like started ruling the physical earth.
For 28,800, and the shepherd king Dumuzid for 36,000. These individuals, along with the final three kings in the cities of Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, form a group that supposedly ruled for nearly 250,000 years. In our current understanding of history, 240,000 years covers almost the entire existence of our species. Yet, the Sumerian scribes recorded these numbers with the same matter-of-fact precision they used to track bushels of grain or movements of the planets. It suggests that, to them, there was a specific, disciplined logic behind the numbers. The key to this logic lies in the Sumerian sexagesimal mathematical system. While we use a base 10 system today, the Sumerians used base 60. It's the reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. In the King List, the massive reigns are almost always multiples of 60. They use specific units called the Sar, which represented 3,600 years, and the Nur, which represented 600. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years, for instance, is exactly 8 Sars. Mainstream historians argue that these numbers are purely symbolic. They suggest that the scribes weren't recording literal years, but were using.
Whenever you hear the term mainstream historians, they're actually paid about shills and they're representing a false narrative. That's always the case.
These large mathematical units to signal the greatness or divine nature of the ruler. It's like saying a king was larger than life by giving him a reign that was mathematically perfect. In this view, the years are a code for status, not a measure of time. If I tell you a historic figure was a giant among men, you don't go looking for an 11-foot tall skeleton, you understand it as a metaphor for their influence. However, even if we accept the symbolic argument, the math remains remarkably complex. When you add up the reigns of these 8 kings, you get 241,200 years. Some researchers have pointed out that these numbers aren't just random multiples of 60, they appear to sync up with astronomical cycles, specifically the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes about 25,920 years to complete one cycle. Why would a society, which mainstream history says was still developing the basics of urban life, be obsessed with 26,000-year astronomical cycles? It does not make any sense whatsoever if they were simply recording myths. To even notice these patterns, you need generations of stable, meticulous observation. This leads to a more professional but intriguing perspective. The King List might be a distorted memory of a genuine, high-functioning epoch that existed long before our standard records begin. Rather than literal immortality, some scholars suggest these reigns might actually represent entire dynasties or epochs of rule categorized under a single name. In the same way, we might refer to the Victorian era to cover many decades of complex.
It's 100% epochs of rules itself, and these rules were uh, corresponding with the zodiac alignments and the procession of the equinoxes, and these dynasties will correspond with that. So a lot of mainstream. That's a historical fact. Doesn't align with mainstream at all. So every time we heard any mainstream historian debunking that, we should probably use our own discerning mind to actually look into these kinds of facts.
Change. The Sumerians might have condensed centuries into these mathematical blocks. It preserves the timeline while removing the need for a 30,000-year-old human. Yet, the Sumerians themselves didn't offer that disclaimer. They presented these figures as literal truth, right alongside the mundane details of canal building and tax collection. They believed their first kings were descended from heaven, a phrase that could imply a different origin, or perhaps just a level of authority that was considered beyond human. Whether you view them as legendary founding fathers or representatives of a lost, sophisticated era, the fact remains that their names were preserved with a reverence that borders on the obsessive. The transition at the end of this list is the most jarring part of the entire artifact. After the 8th king, the list doesn't just trail off into the next dynasty. It hits a wall. The record is interrupted by a catastrophic event that supposedly wiped the slate clean. A global flood that reset the Sumerian civilization in its entirety. If this were just a...
And this global flood is in every mythology, making it conclusive, or you can draw inferences, state that the global flood really actually happened. If it's actually present in many mythologies, we can draw conclusive evidence it actually happened, or some kind of catastrophic event actually happened that wiped every civilization, every form of advanced technology, civilization, tribes, every form of races or nationality. We can actually guess from various mythological floods,
routine seasonal river flood. Why would it
various
mark the
stories of floods.
absolute end of an era defined by 28,000-year reigns? Why did the supposed greatness of the kings vanish along with the cities they ruled? We have to wonder if the flood wasn't just a weather event, but a total systemic reset for the Mesopotamian world. And if that reset happened, what exactly was lost in the water that caused the lifespans of every king thereafter to begin a sudden dramatic collapse? The divide between the age of immortals and the world we recognize today is not described as a gradual change. In Sumerian records, it appears as a sudden break. On the Weld-Blundell prism, A long list of rulers, reigns, and dates continues in an orderly way until it stops abruptly. The next line is simple and direct: the flood swept over the land. This short phrase is a monumental divide, separating an era of legendary longevity from a new, more fragile reality. For decades, academia dismissed this flood as a purely theological device, something the Sumerians used to explain away the gap between their legends and their reality. But in 19
Yeah, same thing. Naturalistic explanations completely dismiss the biblical flood. Also, like, but we can see countless historical examples of the floods across different civilizations and nationalities that reset a global flood that reset humanity itself. There are multiple evidences in different mythologies. So you telling me all those civilizations got it wrong? That's kind of crazy. The naturalistic, the mainstream explanation never truly aligned with me.
29, Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at Ur when he decided to dig a little deeper. Beneath the earliest known human burials, he hit a clean, 8-foot thick layer of water-laid silt. This wasn't just a patch of mud. It was a massive, pristine deposit of clay, containing no artifacts, no bones, and no signs of life. Woolley realized that for a layer of silt that thick to form, the entire valley would have to have been submerged under an immense volume of standing water for a significant period. He noted that the civilization below the silt looked fundamentally different from the one that eventually rebuilt above it. Similar layers of sterile silt have since been identified at other key Sumerian sites like Shuruppak and Kish, often appearing directly above remains from the Jemdet Nasr period, around 2900 BC. It turns out the King List was recording a memory that was physically etched into the earth. By the standards of 2026, the scientific consensus suggests this wasn't necessarily a single global event, but a series of catastrophic regional floods. Mesopotamia was defined by the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers that were notoriously unpredictable. Geological surveys indicate that around 5,000 years ago, heavy glacial melt combined with extreme weather patterns likely caused these rivers to burst their banks on a scale that would have covered the horizon. To a civilization living in a flat river valley, a flood that covers everything you can see is, for all practical purposes, a global extinction event. This Mesopotamian account doesn't exist in a vacuum, which is perhaps the most intriguing part. It shares a striking DNA with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Genesis flood narrative. In the Sumerian version, the hero is Ziusudra. In the later Babylonian version, he is Utnapishtim, and in the Hebrew tradition, he is Noah. While the names change, the mechanics of the
Different names, the same mechanics, the same story. It's crazy.
story remain the same: a divine warning, a massive vessel, and the survival of a small group to restart humanity. The King List, however, treats this reset with a cold, administrative tone. It doesn't focus on the hero's journey, it focuses on the political fallout, explicitly stating that after the water receded, the kingship had to descend from heaven a second time. This is where the math starts to get truly uncomfortable for mainstream historians. Before the flood, the list claims kings ruled for an average of 30,000 years. Immediately after the flood, the numbers take a massive dive. The first post-flood king, Ngushur, is credited with 1,200 years. His successor ruled for 960. The math simply doesn't add up if we assume these were literal years as we define them today. If a regional flood happened in 2900 BC, and we have historically verified kings appearing just a few centuries later, these thousand-year reigns would push the flood back into an era where the archaeology doesn't even support urban kingship. Which leaves us with the question:
There's no like math and mainstream doesn't add up to those kinds of numbers is because who knows what is actually. I don't believe the narrative or just 4.5 billion years old. Things like the great unconformity pro this proves that mainstream narrative, but like a true calendar or a true dates are lost in history. We don't know. Like we just start from the Gregorian or the Julian calendar system. We have inferences on that, but we don't know actually how much, what year, like on precision, like what year this is.
why would the Sumerians record a decline that so perfectly mimics a biological collapse? Could the flood represent more than just water? Some researchers wonder if it's a placeholder for a massive loss of technology or information. In this view, the long-lived kings represent a high-functioning epoch that was so superior that the later Sumerians could only describe it in units of sars and nairs. When that world was submerged, the survivors were left with the fragments of a civilization they could no longer fully maintain. They were effectively a species with amnesia, trying to rebuild a world that had literally been washed away. As the water receded and the new cities rose, the Sumerians struggled to regain that heavenly mandate. But as they did, something strange began to happen to the record. The names started to match up with the physical reality of the desert. If the flood marked the end of the immortals, what kind of people were stepping into the vacuum to take their place? To answer that question, we first have to look at how the Sumerians rebuilt their world. They didn't just wake up in a new era, they effectively restarted the clock in a city called Kish. According to the King List, this was the first place where the kingship landed after it descended from heaven for a second time. It is here that we see the first generation of post-flood rulers, and while they were still living for centuries, the scale of their power had clearly shifted.
They also descended from heaven. Interesting.
The first king of this new dynasty was Ngushur, who ruled for 1,200 years. He was followed by Kulasina Bel, who is credited with 960 years. While these numbers still sound like something out of a legend compared to the 30,000 year reigns of the previous era, it looks like a sudden, biological crash. This section of the list is a fascinating bridge because it shows the Sumerians trying to reconcile their massive legendary past.
I also want to make this clear. I'm not one of those guys that that believe that whatever it's written in a historical document, so it's just like absolute certainty and precise. Like I'm saying, like it aligns with a lot of biblical narrative of floods, a lot of mythology of fallen angels. It aligns with those narratives, but no one actually truly knows what happened in those times. Like
with a shorter, more fragile reality of the present. This phenomenon is often called longevity decay. It is a pattern that appears almost identically in the biblical genealogies of Genesis. Before the flood, figures like Methuselah are said to have lived for nearly a millennium. Immediately after the event, the ages of the patriarchs begin a steep exponential decline until they reach the standard 70 or 80 years we expect today. In the King List, the Kish dynasty serves as the primary example of this transition. It's as if the divine quality of the kingship had been diluted by the disaster, leaving the survivors with a fading connection to their original source of power. One of the most intriguing figures from this period is a king named Etana. He is described in the list as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries. Mainstream history generally views Etana as a mythical hero, but he is also mentioned in later historically verifiable documents as a great unifier. The Sumerians even had a dedicated epic about him that describes a desperate search for a plant of birth to secure an heir. In this story, Etana saves a wounded eagle, and in return, the eagle flies him up into the sky to find the plant in the heavens. When you read the descriptions in the myth of Etana, the details are surprisingly specific for a text written thousands of years before the invention of flight. The text describes the earth shrinking below as they fly higher, how the land looks like a small garden and the sea looks like a breadbasket. It is a very descriptive, visual account of altitude that seems out of place for a civilization that supposedly never left the ground. Whether you take the eagle literally or view it as a metaphor for an early, forgotten method of travel, the Sumerians were clearly trying to tell us that their early post-flood kings still possessed knowledge that was not common to the average person. However, even with these heroic feats,
some kind of ancient technology also,
the lifespans kept dropping. By the time we reach the later kings of Kish, the reigns fall into the hundreds of years, then eventually the 80s and 90s. It is a steady return to the standard human timeline. This creates a friction between the king list and mainstream archaeology. If these kings were ruling for 900 years, they would have occupied a period of history that we already have a fairly clear archaeological record for, and we do not find evidence of individual humans living that long in the 3rd millennium BC. The math simply does not add up if we take it literally, but that does not mean the names are fake. If someone writes a biography and claims a person was a titan who moved mountains, we do not assume the person never existed, we assume the language is hyperbolic. But the Sumerians were incredibly disciplined with their records. If they said Etana ruled for 1,500 years, they might have been referring to his entire house or dynasty, using his name as a placeholder for a specific cultural epic that he found.
that might be possible.
This leads to a realization that the king list isn't just a list of people. It is a map of how the Sumerians viewed the decay of their own civilization. They saw themselves as the descendants of giants, slowly shrinking down to fit a smaller, more restrictive world. But as we move further down the list, we hit a turning point that mainstream history can no longer ignore. We run into a king whose name is no longer just on a clay prism, but on physical stone objects found in the...
The mainstream historians and mainstream narrative itself trying to hide the existence of giants itself. That's another rabbit hole. I suggest you guys to look into it. Like, your guys' mind will be blown. Like, there's a lot of evidences of people who are 8 foot, 9 foot tall, which is back in antiquity, and their bones were excavated. Like, it's crazy.
Dirt. This brings us to a figure whose name changes the nature of the mystery, a ruler named Enmebaragesi. He is the first king on the list whose existence has been proven by physical inscriptions. But here's the problem: the list says he ruled for 900 years. If the archaeology proves he was a real, physical person, how do we handle the fact that his impossible reign is recorded on the same document? To understand how the Sumerians viewed the transition from legend to reality, we have to look at a king named Enmebaragesi. For a long time, historians treated him as just another name on a list of mythical figures, no different from the rulers who allegedly lived for tens of thousands of years. However, archaeology eventually caught up with the text. In the early 20th century, researchers discovered multiple inscribed fragments of alabaster vases in the ruins of the Temple of Enlil at Nippur. These fragments bore a simple but profound inscription: Enmebaragesi, King of Kish. This find changed the nature of the mystery. Enmebaragesi, who ruled around 2700 BC, became the first person on the Sumerian King List whose existence is confirmed by a physical object from his own time. He isn't just a character in a story, he was a living man who commissioned temple offerings and led armies against the neighboring Elamites. But this discovery created a massive paradox for modern science. While the archaeology proves he was a real person, the King List insists that he ruled for exactly 900 years. The math simply does not add up. If we accept the vase as proof of his existence, how do we handle the astronomical lifespan recorded on the same document? It creates a friction that mainstream history has to navigate carefully. On one hand, you have a solid physical artifact found in the dirt. On the other, you have a record that claims this same man lived for nearly a millennium. It suggests that the Sumerians weren't just making up names, but they were applying a very different set of rules to how they measured time and power. The existence of this vast fragment places mainstream archaeology in a corner. If we accept the object as proof that Enmebaragesi was a real, physical person, we must confront the fact that his 900-year reign is recorded on the same artifact as his military victories. It suggests that the King List wasn't just a collection of myths, but a carefully curated timeline designed to graft the legitimacy of a lost, long-lived epoch onto the shorter reigns of the present. When you read the descriptions of this era, something that stands out is how the Sumerians used these names as anchors for their cultural identity. In their view, kingship wasn't just a job, it was a substance that descended and moved from one city to another. By giving Enmebaragesi a 900-year reign, the scribes might have been consolidating several generations of his family's rule into one recognizable name. It's a bit like how we might use the term the Tudors to describe a century of English history, but the Sumerians chose to personify that entire block of time through the founding father of the dynasty. This method of record-keeping allowed the Sumerians to bridge the gap between their heavenly origins and their lived reality. It kept the connection to the immortals alive, even as the actual reigns of the kings were shrinking closer to what we see today. But Enmebaragesi doesn't just appear in temple inscriptions and king lists. He is also a central figure in the epic traditions of Mesopotamia, often appearing as the primary antagonist to the most famous king of them all. Enmebaragesi is recorded as the father of Aga, who famously besieged the city of Uruk. This siege brought him into direct conflict with a ruler whose name has become synonymous with the search for immortality, Gilgamesh. For centuries, Gilgamesh was considered a purely legendary figure, but the fact that he is linked so closely to the historically verified Enmebaragesi raises a startling possibility. If the archaeology proves that the 900-year-old king of Kish was a real person, what does that mean for his contemporaries? We find ourselves at a crossroads where the names on the clay prism are becoming tangible. As we follow the list from Kish to the walls of Uruk, the line between myth and history becomes thinner than ever. If Enmebaragesi was real,
People don't know, like, Sumerian mythology is one of the oldest mythologies ever. Like, it's crazy.
then who else was hiding in plain sight within these ancient records? As the influence of Kish began to wane, the King List records a shift in the seat of power to the city of Uruk. This transition introduces a sequence of rulers that form the core of Mesopotamian heroic tradition, including figures like Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and the most famous of them all, Gilgamesh. In the King List, Gilgamesh is recorded as the 5th king of Uruk, credited with a reign of 126 years. While this is a significant step down from the millennium-long reigns of the previous dynasty, it still places him in a category of longevity that challenges modern biological limits. What makes this section of the list particularly compelling is how it intersects with different types of ancient records. We have the King List itself, which provides a chronological framework. Then we have the literary tradition, specifically the Epic of Gilgamesh, which portrays him as a demigod searching for the secret to eternal life. Finally, we have the physical archaeology. At the site of Warka in modern Iraq, researchers have mapped the remains of Uruk's massive perimeter walls. These fortifications stretch for 6 miles and were once reinforced with nearly 900 defensive towers. The Sumerians themselves explicitly credited Gilgamesh with the construction of these walls, and the scale of the ruins suggests a level of engineering and labor organization that perfectly matches the King List's description of a dominant regional power. When you read the descriptions of Uruk from this era, something that stands out is the high degree of urban planning and social complexity. The city was divided into distinct districts for temples, residences, and gardens, supporting a population that may have reached 50,000 people at its peak. This was not a primitive settlement, it was a sprawling metropolis. The King List reflects this reality by detailing the first dynasty of Uruk as a period of intense expansion. Before Gilgamesh, the list mentions Enmerkar, who is said to have built the city of Uruk itself and supposedly engaged in a long-distance trade war with a distant wealthy land called Arada. The math of these reigns continues to be a point of debate.
You're telling me they build this shit with chisels and shit, with donkeys and horses? Well, come on, bro. You're never building that narrative.
While Gilgamesh's 126 years are more grounded than the 28,000-year reigns of the pre-flood kings, they still occupy a space between reality and legend. Some historians suggest that these specific numbers might be related to the Sumerian system of tracking time through astronomical observation. They were meticulous about the movements of Venus and the moon, and it is possible that the lengths of these reigns were calculated to align with larger celestial cycles, effectively turning the King List into a cosmic calendar. The presence of Gilgamesh on the same physical artifact as historically verified figures like Enmebaragesi creates a strong case for his actual existence. In 2003, an archaeological team claimed to have found what could be the tomb of Gilgamesh beneath the former bed of the Euphrates River, using magnetic imaging to locate a large structure that matched ancient descriptions. While the site remains largely...
Yo, I know this, and they found the tomb of Gilgamesh, and, you know, next day the U.S. was in war with Iraq, and they took over the base. And the United States actually took over the entire architecture, entire excavation, archaeological site, bro. Like, it's crazy. Crazy the amount of cover-up of any historical evidence associated with Gilgamesh and shit.
excavated due to regional instability. The discovery of such precise matches between the text and the ground suggests that the King List is more of a historical guide than we previously assumed. However, as the list moves past the heroic age of Uruk, a new pattern begins to emerge. The reigns of the kings continue to shorten, And the focus of the document shifts from grand, legendary feats to the practicalities of war and city-state rivalry. The kingship begins to move rapidly between cities like Ur, Adab, and Mari. This rapid movement suggests the king list was being used as a weapon of legitimacy.
I'll show you what I'm talking about when they took over the archaeological site. Like, I'll show you in the next video.
It reveals a curated narrative designed to favor specific cities while sentencing their rivals to historical oblivion. If the king list was accurate enough to lead us to the walls of Uruk and the vases of Kish, why does it completely ignore some of the most powerful and influential rulers of the era? There are kings who left behind massive monuments and detailed inscriptions of their own, yet their names are nowhere to be found on the Weld Blundell Prism. This raises the question of whether the list is a complete history, or if it was designed to hide the existence of anyone who didn't fit the official version of the timeline. While the king list provides a remarkably detailed framework of Mesopotamian history, its accuracy is often defined as much by what it leaves out as what it includes. As we move into the later dynasties, we begin to see a pattern of significant omissions that challenge the idea of the document as a neutral historical record. There are entire cities and dynasties that we know existed through archaeological evidence, yet they are completely absent from the Weld Blundell Prism. The most famous example is the city-state of Lagash. Archaeology has unearthed thousands of clay tablets, monumental buildings, and exquisite statues belonging to this city, particularly during the reign of King Gudea. He was one of the most prolific builders and influential rulers in all of Sumer, yet neither he nor any other king of Lagash is mentioned in the king list. This isn't a minor oversight, it is a deliberate exclusion of a regional superpower. If we only had the king list to go by, we would never even know that Lagash existed. This creates a serious conflict between the written word and the physical ground. The reason for these omissions lies in the specific political philosophy of the Sumerians. The king list was designed to support a very specific ideology, the belief that kingship was a singular, divine mandate that could only exist in one city at a time. The scribes who compiled the list were trying to create a narrative of a unified Sumerian nation, even though the reality on the ground was often a chaotic patchwork of rival city-states ruling simultaneously. By excluding Lagash, the authors were effectively erasing a political rival from the official timeline. If a city wasn't on the list, it didn't officially hold the divine kingship, making its rulers illegitimate in the eyes of history. This reveals a side of ancient record-keeping that is actually quite modern. The king list wasn't just a way to remember the past, it was a way to control it. It was a curated narrative designed to legitimize whoever held power at the time the list was being written, usually the kings of Isin or Larsa. This selective memory explains why the kingship seems to jump so rapidly from city to city. In reality, many of these dynasties were likely ruling at the same time in different parts of Mesopotamia. But the king list forced them into a single linear sequence to maintain the illusion of a continuous, solitary rule. When one city was conquered, the scribes simply recorded that the kingship moved to the victor, ignoring the fact that both cities might have been flourishing for centuries, side by side. It also changes how we have to look at those astronomical lifespans from the beginning of the list. If the Sumerian scribes were willing to erase entire centuries of history and powerful kings like Gudea to fit a political narrative, it suggests they were masters of information manipulation. The terrifying aspect of the king list is the realization that we are looking at a version of history that has been scrubbed and reorganized. It is a reminder that the people who write the records have the power to decide who is remembered and who is consigned to oblivion. This raises a question about the integrity of the entire document. If the
that's also true.
later, historically verifiable sections are so heavily edited for political reasons, what does that mean for the early, legendary sections? Were the 28,000-year reigns a similar kind of manipulation, or were they based on an even deeper, more complex set of data that the scribes were trying to preserve within their curated timeline? To find that out, we have to look past the names and into the numbers themselves, where a hidden mathematical code seems to link the king list to the stars. To investigate why the Sumerians recorded such staggering lengths of time, we have to look past the names of the kings and focus on the specific numbers they chose. In many versions of the king list, the total duration of the pre-flood reigns adds up to exactly 432,000 years. This isn't just a large, round number, it is a mathematical constant that appears with startling frequency in ancient traditions across the globe, from the Norse Valhalla to the Vedic scriptures of India. In the field of archaeoastronomy, researchers have noted that 432,000 is a significant multiple of 72. This is the exact number of years it takes for the Earth's axial wobble, or the precession of the equinoxes, to shift the position of the stars by just 1 degree from our perspective. A full cycle of precession takes approximately 25,920 years. When you divide 432,000 by 60, the base of the Sumerian math system, you get 7,200. These ratios suggest that the Sumerians weren't just recording how long a king sat on a throne, but were embedding a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics into their historical timeline. This creates a significant friction with the standard model of history. We are told the Sumerians were the first to develop basic urban administration around 3,500 BC. However, to recognize
This also creates a friction with standard model of astronomy also, like, why does nobody even talk about that? We know why.
the precession of the equinoxes, you need centuries of precise astronomical data. You cannot track a 26,000-year cycle by looking at the sky for a single lifetime. It requires a stable, multi-generational effort of observation that predates the official beginning of Sumerian civilization. It does not make any sense whatsoever for a group of early farmers to possess this data unless they were inheriting it from an even older source. One perspective debated in 2026 is that the King List functions as an astronomical clock. By assigning these processional numbers to their earliest rulers, the Sumerians may have been preserving a memory of a time when human history and the movements of the cosmos were perfectly synchronized. In this view, the 432,000 years represent an era of
The
cosmic
moment of cosmos is always synchronized. Reason why it doesn't seem synchronized to you? Because mainstream, you know, people control the mainstream narratives, lying to you everything about, what this world is, even about space itself. Like, that's just my theory out there.
order that was physically shattered by the Great Flood, leading to the erratic and shorter reigns of the human dynasties that followed. When you look at the math, something that stands out is how the Sumerians used these units to categorize large blocks of time. They used the Sar for 3,600 years, the Ner for 600 years, and the Sas for 60 years to build their timeline. The total pre-flood era is often recorded as 120 Sars. These are clean, elegant numbers that suggest a level of mathematical discipline we usually associate with modern physics. It raises the question of whether the Sumerians were recording history as it happened, or if they were trying to reconstruct a lost past using the only constant they had left: the stars. Ultimately, we are left with three primary ways to interpret this document. The mainstream view is that the numbers are purely symbolic, a mathematical way of saying these kings were divine. The second theory suggests the reigns represent entire dynasties or epochs, condensed into a single name for political simplicity. The third, more provocative theory is that the list is a literal, albeit distorted, record of a high-functioning civilization that existed during the Ice Age, an era where humans tracked the heavens with a level of precision that we are only just now beginning to rediscover. What makes the Weld-Blundell prism so striking is the possibility that it preserves a record of events that later traditions struggled to explain or remember. Rather than describing civilization as a simple progression from primitive beginnings, the text hints at something different. It suggests that early societies may have seen themselves as inheriting the remains of an earlier world, one that had already achieved a high level of organization before it was disrupted. In that sense, the prism reads less like a myth of origins, and more like an attempt to preserve continuity after a collapse. It reflects a culture trying to reconnect with knowledge, authority, and order that it believed once existed, but was no longer fully accessible. So what is your theory on these 28,000-year reigns? Are we looking at a sophisticated mathematical code, or a genuine memory of a law?
I'll show you why there's so much controversy that the United States actually took over the architectural side of Tomb of Gilgamesh. It's an infamous video from my lunch break.
The Sumerian King's List, an old world text that was once on display in Iraq, and it's no longer there, following the 2003 war. The Sumerian King's List, it documented the long reigns of kings, some of which spanned tens of thousands of years. And this contradicts traditional views of Sumerian history and the timeline of civilization. This contradicts the mainstream story that we've all been told. The Sumerian King's List, once here and now gone. So, let's bring it back to life. In order to do this, we have to go back to 2003, where we see that during the Iraq War, 15,000 artifacts were taken from the Iraqi National Museum. 15,000, many of which have never been recovered. Among these items were tablets and inscriptions related to the Sumerian King's List, noting that some versions of the King's List from Iraq are no longer accounted for. They were here in
Yeah, loaded. Like, keyword loaded. Like, it's always like a cleanup, by the mainstream.
2002 in Iraq in a museum and are now missing. We are told that the most complete version of the Sumerian King's List is safe and not missing. And that one's located in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, England. I don't believe that that was the most complete version, because if it was, we all know that that's the one that would be missing. If the Iraqi version of the Sumerian King's List was ever digitized, it was never given to the public. There is no widely recognized or accessible digitized version of the Iraqi-held Sumerian King's List, or any unique version of it that was in the Iraqi National Museum prior to 2003. So not only is it gone, but they also never took a picture of it. Can you believe this? I personally do not. I believe that the photographs are also being withheld from the public. If you are new here, we have proven without a doubt that the mainstream...
If it's released to the public, it'll contradict the mainstream narrative and contradict mainstream history. Entire history textbooks has to be edited.
narrative withholds so much information. They withhold sites. They block things off from the public over and over, and it's all to mold the narrative. Because if they didn't do this, the mainstream story would have been done a long time ago. If you're on the fence about this and you're new, I suggest going to episode 107, episode 109, and 114. Off limits to the public, part 1, part 2, and part 3. These episodes fully expose this.
On the 13th of April, 2003, when I went back to the museum, it was something like as if a hurricane had hit. Completely everything was destroyed. All the documents were on the floor. All the equipment were stolen. And what about the museum itself? It had really a catastrophe.
Why? What are they trying to hide in the first place? Because they truly want, you know, they truly want the public to not know about the real Sumerian King's List or any kind of archaeological information about our true history. And they want it so bad the public doesn't want to know about it. Like, why?
Because the looters were inside the galleries, the looters were in the
I mean, we know why, because this proves the mainstream narrative.
storerooms. And for me, that was the first time in my life to see a museum
And there's like a major agenda or a narrative they're trying to purport, and they're trying to hide the actual truth of the matter.
been looted in that way. It had been ransacked completely. What they could not take, they smashed. During the fall of Baghdad, and what we saw of these horrible scenes of the looting all over the city, and what happened to the museum, this was not the only thing.
Personally, I believe that this so-called looting in Iraq was just this group. They were going in there and removing the 15,000 items from the public. And they did this, where we also know that there were so many more than 15,000. They were undocumented items. We've seen in the British Museum how they have 7.92 million items that are not being shown to the public. So could you imagine how many items were actually in the Iraqi National Museum? It was a lot more than 15,000. They were undocumented items in terms of being digitized, and they obviously knew this. The truth is always out there. This is a game, in my opinion. There are keys, and there are clues, and we've unraveled so many of them. So let's go deeper. Samuel Noah Kramer, a supposed 1900s expert in Sumerian history and Sumerian language, where he transformed the field of Sumerian history and wrote a book called The Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, which I'll post a link to this on X. For anybody who wants to read this 385-page book, I'll post the link. This book was written in 1963 and is one of the only surviving documented accounts of the Iraq version of the Sumerian King's List. And after fully reading it, we have unlocked so much more. Before diving into this book, we have to understand that the Sumerian King's List tablets that are now a part of the Oxford collection in England were acquired in the 1800s yet again. Our timeline over and over. They were taken from Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, and they're now in England. These excavations were typically funded and directed by institutions in Europe and the United States. And then you have to ask, who was it that went into Iraq in 2003 and took these 15,000 plus items? Can you all remind me? Who went back to Iraq basically 200 years later? Who was this? This country was the most prominent European ally of this country in the Iraq War. The Oxford version of the Sumerian King's List was found in 1922. I think they thought they found the whole thing and made a huge mistake, because following the Oxford version's discovery, the Iraq version was then discovered. And then just 70 years later, the Iraq version goes missing, and it's gone forever. Stories on how
Yeah, missing.
to live forever, or at least for thousands of years. Who would be interested in this kind of technology from the old world? It's very interesting. What a terrible mistake in the 1920s, leaving too soon and allowing Iraq to hold some of the most powerful information in the world, the Sumerian King's List. With the same two groups involved in the 1920s and the early 2000s, what are the odds? Gilgamesh asks Utnapishtim for the secret to immortality in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He later reveals the existence of a plant that can restore youth. In episode 109, we located the Epic of Gilgamesh. We know that it's located in the British Museum. It was transported there and is kept stored away. And today, we find out that Samuel Noah Kramer's 1963 book, The Gilgamesh Stories, are discussed in the Iraq version of the Sumerian King's List so many times. And we are just getting started today. Welcome to episode 115 of my lunch break. I hope you're all having a great day. And if you're new, welcome. And I want to thank all of our sponsors over on Abba in the Darkness. You guys are all awesome and helping this channel out a lot. On page 60, we see that they were doing something in the 1960s. According to the King's List, Gilgamesh was a ruler who became the supreme hero of Sumerian myth and legend, where we know at this point that these aren't myths and they are not legends. These are literal text from the old world, in my opinion. Gilgamesh became a hero par excellence of the ancient world, the old world, the previous
What the fuck?
civilization, with an endless drive for fame, glory, and immortality, to such an extent that he has been taken by modern scholars to be a legendary figure rather than a real man and ruler. modern scholars, saying that he was a legend and not real, where we know that he was real, because they were looking for him in the 1960s. Going on to say, although there is some hope that the excavations now being conducted in Erech may uncover some sooner or later the major city in Sumer, present-day Iraq, the location that Gilgamesh was said to rule. In 1955, they found the Tummel inscription, a 10-line
Now I know why the US and all these nations currently fixated on Iraq, Iran, all these, Middle Eastern countries. Was it just for oil or some deeper narrative to try our true history?
inscription that
There's always a deeper agenda than the surface level thinking. Let's on.
explains Imre and Gilgamesh both lived during the same time. Archaeologists have already discovered that Imre was a real individual. They already know that he was real and not a myth. The Tummel inscription found in 1955 proves that Gilgamesh was not a mythical character. They lived at the same time, and these texts are not myth. It's clear. If you were trying to hide the true history of this place that we all live, you would go take the Sumerian Kings List from Iraq in 2003. Clearly, there was something in there that would ruin their mainstream story hour. Within this text, Samuel Noah Kramer tells us something very interesting. Something that goes back to episode 61, the land of Mu, telling us that there was a place called Dilmun, a land of deathlessness and immortality, where this character was transplanted to Dilmun once the gods had granted him immortality. Again, not knowing where Dilmun is located, where I believe that there is more land that we are simply not shown. Dilmun was looked upon by the Sumerians as a blessed paradise land. It appears to have been Enki's home ground. Indeed, it seems to have been, or possibly still is today, the place where all of gods meet. Incredible. The Sumerian Kings List. It's becoming so clear. And it's no wonder this text was taken from our view in Iraq. Could you imagine if this is real? A real place that is here, where I believe it is. And we're not being told about it. If all of these things that are written about the old world are true, that Gilgamesh was real, the Sumerians, all of this would be incredible. We find their texts, and time again, these texts are taken from our view, so-called looted. Could you imagine if there's a land that is pure, bright, and a holy land that is free from sickness, death, and aging? It's mentioned multiple times in texts from the Old World. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, often referred to as a sort of Eden-like garden. Could you even imagine if this place is still here and it's not being shown to us today? I can. This is the location of the Sumerian Kings List in Oxford, a portion of the story in my opinion. We are told that the Weld Blundell prism, an 8-inch high prism, is the most extensive version of the Sumerian Kings List, containing 4 sides, with 2 columns on each side, listing the rulers from before the flood, stating that the kingship had descended from heaven. This is all a myth. It's all a legend. No, I don't believe so. Thank you to all of our badge members, all of our Patreons, and every single subscriber, and everybody. The truth is very powerful. Really included additional details. I believe what was found after the Oxford version was just a continuation from the book that was found originally. I have a feeling that they thought they found the whole thing, and then they took it to Oxford, England, and then Iraq found the rest of the King's List with additional information. So they didn't have the full story in Oxford, and they had to go back and get it in 2003, as well as so much more that they found at the same site, taking or destroying 15,000 plus artifacts from the old world. But I believe that they have the rest of the book now. I don't think that there was just multiple copies of the King's List just laying around. Again, all of this taking place in the 18 and 1900s, and even carrying into the 2000s. So you can see how new our civilization really is. The finders are still finding things. If you've seen all the episodes so far, you're going to see the pattern so clearly. You'll know that a reset took place, and our civilization was just running around finding things in the 18 and 1900s from the old world. It was just who could find it first, and those would be the leaders of this timeline. The people that could find the technology from the old world, the texts, the information, the tablets, the technology. They never documented they found these sites or texts in the 15 or 1600s. We've never seen it to this point. Over hours and hours of documented research, it has never happened. On page 328, titled E, Sumerian Kings List, it goes on to tell us what was on the Iraq version, the one that is now gone forever, the one that no picture remains of it. Samuel Noah Kramer, he told us in 1963 that the Sumerian Kings List told all of us that Eridu Alalim reigned for 28,800 years as king. Alalgar reigned for 36,000 years, with 3 more individuals reigning for 108,000 years, and a grand total of 8 kings, spanning a total of 241,200 years, with a flood then taking place. This is all documented on Old World texts, on the tablets that he saw, and they are now gone. And after the flood, the kings didn't reign nearly as long. 324 years right here, and 900 years right here. It's still much longer than us today, but nowhere near the pre-flood individuals. And this is where we can show that Gilgamesh was very real, and he was much closer to our timeline than what we could have ever imagined. Seeing that according to the Sumerian Kings List, Gilgamesh reigned for 126 years. Something changed. Within the last 1,000 years in this place that we live, something massive. People were bigger. They lived so much longer. And these stories that have been removed from us prove it, in my opinion. The tablets show locations that are still here, that give you immortality. The tablets show the truth about this place that we live. They show who was here, who was powerful, and they gave us the old world technology back. These tablets are being hidden from the public, in my opinion. They have been looted by the exact same groups just 70 years apart. The Sumerian King's List isn't just history. It is a roadmap. It's a key. It's proof that the old world existed and that the old world was far greater than they really want us to know. And I wonder if they didn't want us to know because they just wanted to keep it all for themselves. You tell me. The Sumerian King's List and Genesis, they were either written by the same individuals, or one was looking at the other's work, or they were working together. But one thing is undeniable. Both talk about the flood as a cataclysmic event that resets human history, with divine beings
The flood is really undeniable at this point.
playing a central role. Both Genesis and the Sumerian King's List talk about a golden age, where humans lived under different conditions and lived for so much longer than we've ever seen, just like we've talked about today. And this happened so much closer to our timeline than what we're being told, in my opinion. Both texts talk about the Garden of Eden, or Dilmun. This is a place that humans had immortality. Both stories ending the exact same way. Even the characters play the same exact roles with different names. Noah and Utnapishtim. Both are chosen to survive the flood, and both are warned and helped to survive. The Sumerian King's List and the Book of Genesis are very similar, suggesting a possible connection, with one thing being very clear. Both describe the flood as a cataclysmic event that resets human history, with divine beings playing a central
I think Genesis is a true account, and other mythologies like mythologies of Gilgamesh and Sumerian mythology like proves everything written in the Genesis is actually like factual.
role. Something happened, exactly like we've talked about for years now. A reset, and I don't believe it was thousands of years ago. I believe it was so much closer to our timeline than we could have ever imagined before. These stories give us incredible insight into our true history, as well as our questions about life and our purpose, with one being removed in 2003. This story is not just a random clay tablet. This was so much more important than that. It was stolen from our view. It held stories that are similar to Genesis. Could you imagine if Genesis was taken from us? Parts of it were removed, and we were given the excuse that it was just looted? Stories of the past, turning out to be much more factual than we ever realized. Excavation projects taking place, trying to locate these individuals that are supposedly just myths, finding their texts, and probably so much more. We are going to continue to look deeper.
Yeah, use your discerning mind. Figure out what is actually true, what is actually false. Never believe in the mainstream narrative. Like and sub. See you guys.